Picture it the way the legend wants you to. A black shoreline, a wind from the harbor, and a wall of flame racing through galleries, so full of papyrus you can hear the scrolls curl. Lamps fall, roof beams pop. A scholar runs with an armful of Aristotle, trips, and vanishes into a red tide. A city wakes to smoke and ash, and by sunrise the greatest library on earth is gone. One night, one blaze, one neat ending. That image is unforgettable. It's also suspicious. Real disasters are messy. They don't line up with a single villain, a single date, a single spark that explains everything for the next 2,000 years. If the Library of Alexandria truly died in one night, you would expect the ancient world to howl about it in clear, angry words. Instead, you get something else. Hints, quarrels, fragments, and after-the-fact storytellers trying to stitch a clean tragedy out of a long, complicated leak. Start with the oldest witness you might expect to shout. Strabo, the geographer who actually lived in Alexandria in the 1st century BCE. He describes the Mausian research complex that housed scholars and collections in careful, almost boring detail. He talks about dining halls and lecture rooms, a life funded by the crown. He does not stop to weep over a charred ruin. No smoke in his sentences, no obituary. If a single cataclysm had turned the shelves to cinders a generation before he wrote, his silence is strange. Centuries later, Plutarch gives us a fire during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 BCE. Caesar, pressed in the palace quarter, orders the ships in the harbor burned to block the enemy. Flames spread. Warehouses go up. Plutarch says many places burned, and later readers took that as proof the library itself was doomed. But many places in a port city can mean rope lofts, grain stores, customs depots, the sort of buildings where captured books were sometimes kept before they were copied. A dockside blaze is real. Whether it ran uphill through stone colonnades and guarded stacks is another question entirely. Then there's the problem of the library not being one library. Alexandria had a head and a hand. The Royal Quarter Collection and the so-called daughter library at the Serapeum. Even people who swear the Big Burn happen to disagree about which part went first. If a single night erased everything, why do later sources still talk about scholars, books, and a working intellectual culture in the city? Why does the Serapeum remain a center of learning into the 4th century? A clean catastrophe doesn't leave that kind of debris field. The single blaze picture has another weakness: papyrus itself. Scrolls don't sit forever waiting for the perfect tragedy. They mold, they flake, they break at the crease where 1,000 hands have rolled and unrolled them. Librarians in antiquity knew this. They copied constantly. A collection as active as Alexandria's was a living organism, shedding and renewing. That means loss didn't need a matchstick. Time was already eating the shelves. But stories prefer a culprit. A bonfire gives you one. Over the centuries, blame has been handed around like a torch no one wants to hold for long. Caesar's soldiers. Zealous bishops in the age of temple closures. A conquering general in the 7th century whose supposed order about books not in the book appears in sources written centuries after the fact. Each version picks a moment and a motive that fit the politics of the storyteller's own era. Each version says, here, this is when knowledge died. Simple, satisfying, maybe too satisfying. There's another discomfort. Numbers. You've seen the claims. 40,000 scrolls. And then there's the way the legend works on us. We want the loss of knowledge to be dramatic, because drama is a warning. Look what one fire can do. It's a morality tale for every age that forgets to fund its archives, or cuts the quiet budget line that pays for preservation. But the more you look, the more the Library of Alexandria resembles something worse than a blaze. It looks like a slow rules change. Port policies that stopped seizing every ship's scrolls. Palace money diverted to other projects. Religious and political priorities that made certain texts awkward to maintain. Copyists who trained elsewhere. Scholars who left. Catalogs that weren't updated. 1,000 small decisions that make a great machine cough, stall, and finally sit quiet. Consider the psychology of memory. A single night ending gives closure and protects the living from blame. If a freak fire destroyed the library, then nobody killed it by neglect. No official throttled its intake. No community decided other kinds of writing mattered more. A blaze is tragedy. Slow decay is responsibility. That's why the legend is powerful. It lets everyone mourn without asking who locked the doors. Still, you can't dismiss the fire stories as pure invention. Alexandria was a city where flames were a normal risk. Oil, rope, timber, warehouses, kitchens, lamps, forges, this is what ports are made of. There were riots, there were sieges. There were temple closures and forced conversions and mobs that used libraries as symbols of the old order. Things did burn. The question isn't whether heat touched papyrus. Of course it did. The question is whether a single night erased the world's memory or whether centuries erased it by inches, while later writers push all the smoke into one mesmerizing column. Listen to how the legend talks. It whispers that knowledge is fragile. True. It also tries to convince you that knowledge is mainly fragile to fire. Less true. Knowledge is most fragile to policy, to boredom, to the quiet moment when a clerk decides not to requisition fresh papyrus this year. If you can understand that, the story of Alexandria stops being a sad campfire tale and becomes a map of how to protect any archive, anywhere now. So did the library burn? Parts of it, sometimes, under different regimes, for different reasons, sure. Did a single inferno end it? The sources won't carry that weight. When you stack them in daylight, ancient geographers, later biographers, temple records, archaeology, the neat ending starts to wobble. What stands firm is something less theatrical, more human. A system that once vacuumed up the world's words was allowed, piece by piece, to slow down until even its myth had to invent a bigger ending to explain why it stopped. But to really see why the myth took hold, and how the machine actually worked when it was alive, we need to walk inside it, shelf by shelf, and watch the city that fed it do its quiet, relentless work. Because once you see the system, you'll see how a system can fail without any flames at all. Step through the front door of the machine, and the noise is not fire, it's scratching. Reed pens on papyrus, knives trimming edges, cord thumping around bundles of scrolls. Alexandria's Messier, the place of the muses, wasn't a silent temple. It was a factory for thought. It had dining halls because scholars lived there on state stipends. It had lecture rooms because ideas needed stages. But its beating heart was a stream of paper moving from ship to shelf to copy bench to shelf again, day and night, like a port for words. The system started at the waterline. Every ship that tied up at the Heptastadian Causeway or along the Royal Quays faced the same ritual. Inspectors boarded not only to tally cargo, but to ask for books. In a trading world where merchants carried handbooks, pilots kept coastal guides, and travelers tucked rolls of poetry into baggage, that one word covered maps, medicine, plays, philosophy, even cooks' receipts. Anything written was fair game. The rule was blunt: surrender the scrolls. They would be sent up to the royal quarter, copied, and returned. Except returned meant something different in Alexandria than in any other city. The originals were kept in the crown's library. The ship received clean, careful copies labeled from the ships. Conquest without blood, paid for in ink. Up the hill, the logistics were as sharp as a mint. Runners carried each bundle to an intake desk, where clerks unrolled the first few columns, noting title, author, if stated, dialect, and condition. Duplicate? Keep it anyway variants were the fuel of this place. Working copies went to the scriptorium. Long tables, baskets of black and red ink, lamps for overcast days, and copyists trained to hear lines as they wrote them. Speed mattered, but so did accuracy. One reader sang the text, while two scribes wrote, checking each other's ears against the voice. Where two copies disagreed, a senior editor stepped in. The messier didn't just collect, it corrected. The editors were the quiet muscle behind the shelves. They hunted errors, weighed versions, and chose standard readings. Think of Zenodotus cutting false lines from Homer, Aristophanes of Byzantium, adding breathing marks to tame tricky Greek, Aristarchus judging which words were really ancient and which were later gloss. This was not vandalism. It was quality control for a civilization. When a student in Cyprus recited Homer, the voice they used had, in a way, passed through Alexandria's hands. That is the scale we're talking about. None of it works without papyrus, the Nile's gift, and the library's addiction. Reeds were harvested upriver, sliced, pressed, and dried into sheets, then glued into scrolls and polished with a pumice-like stone until smooth. Alexandria did not merely buy papyrus. The Ptolemaic state controlled it, tightening exports when rival libraries wanted to grow. Shelves filled with rolls, capped by wooden tags title, author, sometimes a short note about contents. The scent in those rooms was gum, oil, and dried river. To keep bugs away, cedar and other resins were used. A bad summer could warp 1,000 spines. Cure was storage, cases, cupboards, and a librarian's superstition: never stack too tight, never too light. Acquisitions were a royal sport. Crown agents traveled with lists and cash to buy copies from temples, playwrights, physicians, and private collections across the Mediterranean. When lists failed, diplomacy stepped in. One famous tale says the Ptolemies borrowed Athens' official copies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, The building was a campus, but the library functioned like an organism with rooms acting as organs: intake, correction, translation, commentary, and reference. Translation was crucial. Egypt was a crossroads. Texts arrived in Ionic Greek, Doric Greek, Egyptian, Phoenician, and more. A practical team turned them into working Greek, sometimes rough, sometimes fine, because usefulness beat purity. The goal was not a museum. It was a toolbox. All of this cost money, and money shapes memory. A royal stipend paid scholars to eat together at a common table, a simple trick that prevented cliques from turning the place into feuding schools. Stipends bought time to compare manuscripts, to carve notes in the margins, to sort duplicates, to produce editions clean master copies that other cities begged for. The king who controlled that purse controlled the speed of the machine. If funding slowed, the copy benches thinned. If politics heated, acquisitions cooled. The Mausian was a crown project. When the crown's attention drifted, you could hear the scratch of pens fade. Walk the shelves in your mind, and you see why later people dreamed up huge totals. Every long work was many rolls. Histories came in book after book. Each book one roll. Commentaries on those histories, often longer than the works they explained, sat beside them. A physician's manual might exist in 10 versions, with different case notes. Now multiply that by genres: astronomy, law, rhetoric, comedy, hymn, travel, things worth knowing for sailors, on and on. Was it hundreds of thousands of books? If book means one roll, the numbers swell. If book means unique title, they shrink. The point isn't the exact count, it's the appetite. Alexandria wanted everything. The appetite reached beyond collecting into standardizing how people found what they needed. New arrivals were tagged and slotted. Reference desks existed not for tourists, but for scholars who had to navigate a forest of near-identical titles. Imagine trying to find On the Soul when a dozen authors wrote something called exactly that. Imagine asking for hymns in a city where every shrine had a stack. Without a map, the library would have become a swamp. With a map, it became a city you could cross at speed. Efficiency bred ambition. Once you can copy fast, you can request faster. Once you request faster, you discover gaps. Gaps lead to missions. A team to Sicily for medical treatises. Another to the Levant for early law codes. A letter to a ruler begging a temple to lend its oldest cosmology rolls. Each mission returned with a pile and a problem. Divergent versions, strange dialects, obscure titles. The fix was not more shelves. The fix was a master list that could speak for the whole library, work by work, roll by roll. There's a darker angle hiding in this brilliance. Yet even when the benches were full and the runners fast, the library faced a brutal fact. Memory is useless without a way to find it. 1,000 scrolls of poetry are not culture. They are clutter. The Messier understood this and built a tool to tame the clutter. A single work that tried to index the Greek-speaking world's mind. It was more than a list. It was a table of contents for a civilization. And it became the quiet skeleton of everything Alexandria did next. To follow the library from intake to insight, you have to open that catalog and see how it spoke. And the moment you crack it, you discover a secret. Even when shelves vanish, the index can tell you what used to live there. Open the catalog. Not a codex, not cards in a drawer rows of long, neat rolls that together formed one work. The Pinakes. Tables. Callimachus of Cyrene, poet and editor, took a problem as big as the Mediterranean and tried to tame it with order. Later writers say his catalog ran to roughly 100+ rolls. Think of that. A library so vast, it needed a library-sized book just to say what it owned. If the Messier was a city of paper, the Pinakes was its street map, census, and phone book in one. Callimachus began with the simplest question any reader asks. What kind of thing is this? He grouped the world by craft epic, lyric, tragedy, comedy, history, law, medicine, mathematics, natural science, miscellany. Within each craft, he listed the makers, one by one, and under each maker, the works. Not just titles, but details a working scholar cannot live without. First words, so you know which. On the soul, you're actually holding. How many rolls long, so you're not missing book 3 without knowing it. Alternate titles, because scribes rename things, and notes on authenticity, because famous names attract fakes like harbors attract gulls. If 2 copies disagreed, he said so. If a text was rumored to be someone else's, he warned you. The catalog didn't just point. It judged. He added short biographical sketches, birthplace, teachers, the city where a writer worked, because books grow from people, and knowing the person helps you test the page. If a Homeric hymn used words no one used until a much later century, a good editor's eyebrow should jump. The Pinakes taught those eyebrows when to jump. In a world that did not yet have footnotes, Callimachus invented metadata by instinct. Context, variants, cross-references, the small facts that save you from big errors. The physical library echoed the catalog's logic. Each shelf held rolls tagged at the end with little labels, the city bows, that carried the core of what the Pinakes said in summary. Author, work, sometimes a quick descriptor. Pull a roll. Check the tag. Confirm it against the words in the catalog. Copy, compare, comment. The Pinakes amplified every other room's work. Acquisition teams could see gaps. Copyists could spot a missing roll. Translators could find parallels across genres. A scholar could walk in and ask a real question. Where is the earliest treatise on nerve injuries? And not be swallowed by noise. There's a paradox hidden in that elegance. The more perfectly a system describes itself, the more it leaves a long shadow when the light goes out. The Pinakes is lost. We do not have its rolls, but it left fingerprints everywhere. Later compilers echo its choices. Biographical notes in distant lexicons feel like they've been lifted from it. Lists of works that survive only by title probably came from it. When you see a tidy run of a playwright, stramas with clean counts and short bios in a later source, you're often looking at a reflection of Callimachus's table, bounced through centuries of editors, who could not bear to work blind after learning to see. That tells you something crucial about the clean burn myth. If a single night erased the library, the catalog would be the first thing people tried to recreate. Because without the index, the loss is not just books, it's navigation. Yet whenever we glimpse later Alexandrian scholarship, we still see catalog habits at work. Precise attributions, numbered rolls, fights over which lines belong to whom. You don't too behave like that in a city that has just watched its map turn to ash. You behave like that in a place where the map still guides you, even if some streets are blocked. Consider how the Pinakes handled abundance. A poet like Euripides had a crowded shelf. Tragedies, satyr plays, fragments, spurious pieces that later fans slid under his name to give their favorites prestige. Without a catalog, you either trust the loudest fan or shrug. With the Pinakes, an editor could say, genuine, doubtful, from the Playhouse copies, from a private collection. That level of discrimination is not born during recovery from disaster. It is built during decades of steady work. The catalog presumes a living institution. Acquisitions flowing in, corrections flowing out, disputes settled at benches where all versions sit within reach. It also presumes money and politics. The catalog reflects a royal decision to define and thereby claim the Greek-speaking world's literature. To catalog is to draw a border. Inside are the works we consider canon. Outside are outliers, rumors, things not worth the shelf space. That power is heady. It tells you why the library felt like more than a building. It was a culture shaper. And culture shapers rarely die from one blow. They bend when their patrons change priorities. They thin when their supply lines dry. They drift when their priests, princes, or prefects decide other rituals matter more. There's another clue in the way the Pinakes solved naming problems. Antiquity reused titles, like families reuse first names. Every city had a founding, a on law, a against X, a on the soul. Callimachus' decision to record first words in sipits seems fussy until you face a shelf of 10. On nature, rolls by different thinkers. The incipit is a serial number in a world before ISBNs. That habit outlived the library. Medieval scribes still copied incipits into lists, because once you learn the trick that differentiates twins, you don't go back to guessing. Again, that persistence argues against a disappeared system. Habits lasted because the thing that taught them lasted long enough to seed them across regions. So what can a lost catalog still tell us? First, scope. The library did not only chase drama and philosophy. It cared about handbooks, travel guides, technical manuals, temple inventories. Second, hierarchy. By placing crafts side by side, the Pinakes declared that a doctor's casebook could sit with a poet's hymn without either one being treated as trash. Third, time. Notes on authenticity and dialect knitted language to chronology. If a text used post-classical forms, a good catalog warned you not to date it to the distant past. Those three features, scope, parity, and chronological sensitivity, are the bones of a research culture. Remove anyone, and the body stumbles. Remove all three, and it forgets how to walk. Now flip the logic. If you wanted to weaken a place like this without lighting a torch, where would you press? Not the shelves, first the index. Stop updating the Pinakes. Let new arrivals go unrecorded. Allow duplicates and forgeries to float. Make it harder for scholars to know what is real and where it lives. Confusion is a quieter fire. It wastes hours. It sends readers in circles. It convinces patrons that the place doesn't work anymore. And once the index stutters, the rest of the machine follows. Fewer corrections, more noise, a slow loss of trust that looks, from a distance, like decay. That detail matters when you weigh the famous flames. If a blaze at the docks in 48 BCE scorched warehouses, it may have singed from the ships, copies waiting for processing. It may have destroyed bundles of raw intake scrolls. That's a wound, but not a death blow if the master catalog, the edited copies, and the habits that keep them aligned still stand uphill. A city built for books expects to fight smoke sometimes. The question is not, did anything burn? But did the parts that make a library survive? The only way to test that is to leave the calm of Callimachus' sworder and walk onto a hard night. The siege where Julius Caesar, cornered in the royal quarter, ordered the harbor burned to save his army. The legend says the flames leapt from ship to shore and turned knowledge to ash. But the sources disagree. The topography complicates things, and the Pinakes shadow lingers where the story says it shouldn't. To learn what actually burned and what that meant for the stacks, we have to stand on the quay with Caesar and watch the fire spread, piece by piece. Put yourself on the shore in winter, 48 BCE. Wind off the great harbor carries pitch and salt and the short, hot breaths of men who know that if the water isn't blocked, they're finished. Julius Caesar is cornered in the royal quarter. Enemy forces crowd the city. The palace walls guard him on one side, the sea on the other. The order goes out. Torch the fleet. If Alexandria's ships can't sail, neither can the army that wants entrapped. Fire becomes a barricade. Flames begin where fire is always hungry rigging, sails, resin-smeared planks. A gust turns rope lofts into candles. Boatyards go next. Tar bubbles. Oars crack. In the harbor's mirror, masts become a forest of bright branches and collapse into a raft of embers drifting toward the docks. It's a soldier's tactic and a city's nightmare, because ports don't store only ships. Ports store everything that has to move: grain, flax, timber, oil, and paper. Alexandria didn't keep its whole memory uphill behind colonnades. Part of it lived where the work happened. Intake depots, bonded warehouses, customs sheds piled with seized rolls waiting for clerks and copyists. The library's calm rooms depended on those rough rooms. The from the ships stream always passed through the harbor first. So when ancient reports say, many places burned during Caesar's siege, you can hear the specific places inside that vagueness. Rope sheds, granaries, and the kind of storehouses that temporarily held newly confiscated scrolls. Now lay the map over the flames. Alexandria had two main harbors, the Great Harbor by the Royal Quarter and, to the west, Ionostos separated by the long heptastadian causeway tying the island of Pharos to the mainland. The palace district, the Bruchian, sat along the Great Harbor. The Mausian and its main stacks were within or near that royal zone, wrapped in stone, with courtyards and broad streets between buildings. Stone doesn't love to burn. Open courts break fire. Water is close at hand. A dockside inferno can be vast. A palace archive need, not follow. Ancient writers don't agree on the reach of the blaze. Later storytellers, hungry for a clean tragedy, put the great library itself in the path and call it finished. Others who knew the city as layout talk about burned ships and keys and leave the Mausion out of it. A geographer writing within a lifetime of the siege describes the Mausion as a functioning institution with scholars on stipend. He writes like a man for whom the library still exists. Either he missed a cataclysm on his doorstep, or the catastrophe wasn't there. There is another angle. What burns at a dockside fire hurts most a system's edges. Intake stock is fragile by definition, unprocessed, uncatalogued, often unvetted. A blaze that swallows that stock is like flooding a publisher's mailroom. It delays the next season of books. If, from the ships, rolls were destroyed in harbor warehouses, the damage could feel enormous to the scholars waiting uphill for new material, and yet leave the curated, edited core intact. The library could limp and grieve without dying. Consider how heat moves in a port city. It loves tight spaces, cloth, tarred rope, stacked amphorae, corked with straw. It hates cut stone, big air, and distance. The Bruchians' palaces and the Mausians' halls weren't a continuous plank maze. Even if sparks reached the quarter, they faced yards, fountains, and walls. A catastrophe that purged the docks may have scorched nearby offices and private collections, but still failed to claw into the controlled cold of archive rooms. In the legend, Caesar becomes the villain who burned human memory to save himself. The motive is neat, the symbolism neater. But the commander who wrote cool, logistical commentaries also knew that starving an enemy's port hurts their army more than it hurts your notes. If he had intended to erase a civilization's bookshelf, he picked a clumsy method. More likely, he did what besieged leaders do: deny the harbor and accept collateral loss he could neither measure nor weigh in that hour. The tragedy is real. The assumption about its target is not. Numbers inflate the grief. If you've been told for generations that the library held hundreds of thousands of books, then any fire near any room that ever held a scroll feels world-ending. But count the layers. How many of those books were spare copies for copyists? How many were shipboard manuals, coastal guides, itineraries, merchant lists useful? Yes, but not the crown of the stacks. Loss is loss. Still, the picture of a single night consuming Aristotle, Hipparchus, and every annotated Homer is theater, not evidence. Look at the aftermath you can actually see. Alexandria did not become a bookless city in the years after the siege. Scholars kept working there. Philosophical schools argued. Editors continued to standardize texts. The daughter library at the Serapeum maintained activity into the 4th century. That continuity does not look like a city that watched its central organ die in one blaze. It looks like a patient with a burned hand who still breathes and thinks someone bandaged, not buried. None of this denies that flames left scars. A scribe whose intake rolls were lost would remember that winter as the year the books burned. A merchant whose private stock of plays in a harbor loft went up would tell grandchildren that Caesar burned the library. A clerk who counted crates might quietly revise numbers downward for years because certain titles just stopped arriving. Oral memory squeezes detail until one sentence fits every hurt. That was when the library burned. A legend is born. Except that, and a different picture forms. Caesar's fire was a wound in a knowledge machine that operated at the scale of a city. It damaged the periphery, the docks, the depots, the places where paper first touched Alexandria. It may have singed offices where scholars worked, and perhaps rooms that fed the main repository, depending on how far the flames walked. It likely ruined stores of papyrus and slowed acquisitions for years. But it didn't end the organism. The bones, stone rooms, funded benches, catalogs, and master copies still held. Why then did later writers want the wound to be fatal? Grief sells, yes, but a fatal blaze also absolves everyone after Caesar. If the great loss happened that night, then later budget cuts, policy shifts, temple politics, and street riots bear no blame. And yet the tale that the library needed replacing gave birth to another legend, that Mark Antony delivered a conquered library as a gift to Cleopatra. A romantic image of restoration that says as much about power as it does about paper. Follow that gift into the palace, and we will see how post-siege Alexandria turned loss into theater, and why a story about replacing shelves reveals who controlled culture and who wanted the world to believe they could give it back. After the smoke of Caesar's winter siege thinned, Alexandria still breathed, and its queen understood better than anyone that a city like hers survives by mind as much as by muscle. Cleopatra VII was no prop in a love story. She grew up in the palace school that had once fed the Messian, spoke to ambassadors in their own tongues, and argued policy in Greek that could cut. If docks and depots had lost bundles from the ship's scrolls, she would have felt the gap not as romance, but as logistics. Fewer texts for copyists, thinner fodder for scholars. A slackening hum in halls that once sounded like a hive. That is the world into which a legend steps. Mark Antony, the Roman strongman turned Eastern kingmaker, gifts Cleopatra 200,000 volumes from Pergamon to refill Alexandria's shelves. It's a rich tale. Pergamon Hill City in Asia Minor, proud of its rival library, proud of its parchments sending its textual wealth across the sea as tribute to a queen, whose city once embargoed papyrus to slow that very rival. The numbers rhyme in a way storytellers love. The same vast counts rumored for Alexandria appear again in the gift. 200,000 rolls, like 200,000 breaths blown back into a tired lung. The symbolism is clean. Alexandria, wounded by Roman fire, is healed by Roman love. A neat myth needs neat math. Now put your hands on the numbers. 200,000 in ancient bookkeeping could mean 200,000 rolls, not unique works. A single long history might run to 20. A commentary could double that. A city could ship 200,000 pieces and still be sending a far smaller number of distinct texts. And Pergamon's shelves, like every great library's, were stacked with duplicates and working copies. If Antony had wanted to make a grand gesture without bleeding Pergamon white, he could have selected spare copies by the crate, inflated by the way ancient counting works, and produced a figure that dazzled without actually emptying a rival. But even duplicates have weight. Imagine the logistics of boxing, cording, and loading that many rolls, no matter how you count. Pergamon's Acropolis sits on steep stone. The library's rooms were inside palaces and temples. Moving the stock to the harbor would have taken teams, time, carts, a string of ships, and a steady sea. All this during a period when Antony's coalition, Cleopatra's kingdom, and their enemies watched each other with knives. A transfer of that scale becomes not just an intellectual move, but a military one. A convoy worth raiding. If it happened, it was a campaign. No surviving ancient narrative gives that campaign the detail a city-sized shipment would deserve. Then consider who tells the story. Rome's later winner, Octavian, who would rename himself Augustus, needed a reason to make Antony look like a man who had betrayed Rome's values. Antony, the argument went, had gone soft, Eastern, bewitched. What better symbol of this than giving a Greek library to an Egyptian queen? The charge lands on two fronts: theft of Roman-adjacent heritage and surrender to a foreign woman. It paints Antony as a man who would move the axis of civilization for love. That reads like propaganda more than shipping manifest. It doesn't mean nothing moved. It means that a clean headline hides a messier truth. Cleopatra wanted books and scholars. Antony had the power to seize, compel, or borrow, as Ptolemaic kings had done before. Pergamon's scribes could have been tasked to produce master copies quickly to be sent to Alexandria parchment rolls that could stand in for papyrus, to be recopied onto local stock later. Copy houses can do in a season what physical plunder might fail to do in a year. transfer a librarian without attempting to transfer its entire body. Gifted then becomes a word for granted access, ordered duplication, arranged delivery, a quieter kind of conquest. There's a second way to read gift, rights, not roles. The Ptolemies had spent generations turning the Mediterranean's texts into Alexandria's editions. Pergamon had its own traditions, variant readings, editorial decisions. Antony could have awarded Cleopatra the right to claim Pergamon as master texts as the base for Alexandrian editions, merging rival streams under her authority. In that world, 200,000 becomes a rounded figure for as much of Pergamon as we need. For a queen who knew that catalogs, not crates, decide culture, that sort of grant would be as potent as a fleet of ships. The myth also rests on a question of where any influx would go. The main repository in the royal quarter was a crown jewel and a target. But the city had a second organ, the Serapeum, the temple complex on the southwestern hill that housed the daughter library. Part sanctuary, part school, part annex, it held shelves, porticos, and classrooms that could swallow a windfall without crowding the palace. A practical queen who had to show her people that the city as mind still thrived would not hide every treasure in a single royal cluster. The Serapeum's halls gave her a place to plant public proof. Scholars at benches, teachers at work, scrolls unrolled in a building that belonged to the city as much as to the crown. This is where the Antony gift tale does its cleverest work. It lets later writers bridge two needs at once, explain replenishment after the siege, and seat Cleopatra's reign inside a story about culture, not only power. She loved books so much that books came to her, the story says, and in saying it, it absolves the rest of us from asking about budgets, copy programs, doc policy, and the longer, duller choices that keep a library alive. A gift erases administrators. A convoy erases clerks. Alexandria becomes a stage again, not a factory. Even the Pergamon angle carries a quiet joke. Generations earlier, when Pergamon began to rise as a rival, Alexandrian policy allegedly tightened papyrus exports, nudging Pergamon to refine parchment pergaminum into a serious alternative. The rumor oversimplifies. Parchment existed long before, but the rivalry was real. To claim Pergamon's texts, or even to merge editions, would be to win the long race by pulling your opponent's breath into your lungs. It turns a contest of materials into a story about one catalog swallowing another. What remains after you sift the legend is a portrait of Cleopatra as an operator who understood the truth laid bare by the Mosian's daily work. A library is a flow. You can restart a flow in many ways, by forcing ports to part with shipboard manuals again, by funding translation benches, by raiding rival copy houses, by making visas easy for scholars who will relocate with their personal bundles. A love story makes for cleaner marble. A procurement program makes for fuller shelves. Power often chooses the marble. And yet, even if every Pergamon tale is propaganda, the Serapeum's role in the city's mind remains. The annex was more than overflow. It was a public engine where Alexandrians could see what the city valued. If you want to test whether post-Caesar Alexandria truly recovered its intellectual pulse, you don't stare at palace walls and imagine crates. You walk up to the Serapeum and listen for pens. The harder test comes later. Centuries pass. The city's rulers change clothes and gods. New decrees move through streets like weather. And one year, edicts and anger converge on that annex with an energy no catalog can divert. If the legend of a single blaze at the main library hides a slow decay, the Serapeum's end forces you to watch how a space is erased in daylight. Proof that when a city wants to silence a memory, it doesn't always need to burn the head. It can break the hand. Walk uphill from the royal quarter, away from the glare of the great harbor, toward the southwestern ridge, where a different kind of light once pooled. The Serapeum was not a warehouse of books. It was a temple complex, broad steps, high colonnades. a long court where sun striped the pavement through forested columns. At its heart stood Serapeum, a god cobbled from Egyptian and Greek threads, a patron of healing, fate, and knowledge. Around that sacred core, porticos and rooms held shelves. Teachers lectured in the shade. Students argued under statues. Priests moved between shrines and studied like a shuttle through cloth. If the palace library was the mind of the city, this was its right hand. The daughter library label is a modern convenience, but the function was real. Alexandria's knowledge system had outgrown a single cluster of rooms long before Caesar's ordeal. The Serapeum stacks relieved pressure on the royal quarter and placed learning in a public space that ordinary Alexandrians could enter, watch, and sometimes join. A visitor who would never be invited into the palace could still stand beneath the colonnade and hear a reader sing a line from Euripides or demonstrate a bit of geometry with a pebble and a string. Temples in the ancient world were not only for rituals, they were also for record keeping, storage, and civic memory. Here, memory and ritual overlapped on purpose. The layout helped. Unlike the tight inventories of the main stacks, the Serapeum's porticos encouraged circulation. Imagine long benches, low cupboards, rolls lying in neat ranks whose wooden tags faced outward. The air smelled of incense from the sanctuary, oil from lamps, cedar from treated wood. A scroll's fibers responded to that microclimate. Too dry and they cracked, too damp and they bloomed. The temple staff understood that and moderated the space with simple arts, shade, drafts, timing. Where a crown librarian thought in intake and edition, a temple librarian thought in seasons and breadth. Part of what lived here was overflow duplicate copies, teaching texts, popular works, local records. But the Serapeum was not merely a place for seconds. It was a bridge. Translators who worked up in the palace needed students to test their Greek against speech. Teachers who ran courses needed reliable copies to work from. A temple annex provided both shelves close enough to the public to be useful, close enough to the messier to be corrected. Work flowed uphill and downhill between these centers. That two-way traffic kept the whole organism nimble. Then the weather changed. Not the Nile breeze, but the law. In the later 4th century, imperial edicts began to close the hand that had long tolerated many cults beneath a single state. Shrines were ordered shut, sacrifices banned, property of the old temples reclassified as public. Under those decrees, temple libraries anywhere were suddenly suspect, not for what they contained, but for what they symbolized. A competing center of authority with its own rituals, paymasters, and public stage. In a city where knowledge had worn a priest's cloak for centuries, that was not a small shift. It was a change to the grammar of daily life. Alexandria did not digest the change quietly. Street fights in this town were old news. It had seen riots over grain, bishops, theater, and taxes. But when policy and politics converge on a sacred place, the stones themselves become arguments. Contemporary accounts say the Serapeum and its great statue were targeted in 391 CE. Crowds formed, sanctuaries were stormed, the idol was hauled down and broken. What matters for the story of books is how the site was treated after. The best way to erase a space of memory is not to torch it and leave a black scar. It's to take possession and convert it, to make the lines of the old house hold new furniture. Pieces of the Serapeum were dismantled, repurposed, reinscribed. Broken columns found second lives in churches. Carved blocks migrated to public works. The precinct's footprints were walked by new processions. There may have been rooms set ablaze that day. There were certainly rooms emptied, catalog tables overturned, cupboards forced. But the core act was not a bonfire that ate a city's mind overnight. It was a political decision to pull the plug on a space where books and gods had shared a roof. A purge of space, not a single blaze. That difference changes the angle of the light. If an annex is dismantled deliberately, the people who used it don't tell a fire story. They tell a harder story. A place they loved was declared improper, and all the useful habits that lived under its eaves had to migrate or die. Teachers shifted to private homes or church schools. Scrolls that were easy to reach became harder to find. Duplicate copies that let students handle the same text together vanished into private chests. The city lost not only shelves, but a rhythm, the daily choreography of walking up the hill to a lecture and down again to an editor. The machine didn't crash. It juddered. There is a temptation to glue this event to a later one. The attack on a scholar who taught in Alexandria a generation afterward, proof that the city had turned against thought itself. But to use that tragedy as the Serapeum's coda is to commit the same error, the Big Burn. Legend makes folding decades into one night to simplify feelings. The annex's end has its own logic. Close a temple, close its classrooms, strip a site, strip its shelves. Let time and relocation do the rest. The story is less theatrical and more instructive. A library tied to a cult can be shut by decree. A city that wants to keep its books needs to uncouple those systems or risk losing both together. You can still feel the absence in the archaeology. The hill's surviving fragments show footing where the porticos ran, column drums that once marked sightlines, scraps of stair that carried feet into the court. The Serapeum's silhouette is easier to trace than its content. That is loss of a particular kind. When shelves are burned, ash remembers. When shelves are emptied, paperwork tries to keep score, then stops trying. The silence afterward is harder to measure because it looks like ordinary life in a city learning new routines. And yet, despite the edict, the purge, and the broken idol, Alexandria did not become stupid overnight. People kept copying elsewhere. Private libraries mattered more. Scribes who once worked in temple light now trimmed their lamps in townhouses. Some church schools, depending on who led them, absorbed skills honed under the colonnades. The habit of comparing versions, the love of clean text, the art of teaching in a circle with a text in the middle like a hearth. Knowledge is opportunistic. It seeks shelter and keeps walking. So why does the Serapeum loom so large in the burning picture? Because it gives the legend something a dockside fire can't. A stage. Columns come down. An idol shatters. A city watches. Those images travel well. But the work the annex did routine. Exchange doesn't have a single picture to carry it. We mourn the statue because it falls in one moment. We miss the shelves because we only notice their absence a year later when a student can't find the text that used to be on the fourth cupboard left of the stairs. Put your finger on the lesson. If you build a library into a temple, a change of gods endangers the books. If you build it into a palace, a change of dynasty endangers them too. Libraries live longer when they anchor themselves to multiple patrons, multiple spaces, multiple habits, and a material that fights time as well as politics. That last piece is the one Alexandria never solved. Papyrus was a miracle for speed and cost, but not for permanence. What looks like an enemy's torch is often your own material aging out. A scroll phrase at the outer edge first. A cracked roll snaps when a student hurries it. Mold eats from the core. A teacher trims a damaged end and calls what remains a book. Multiply that by thousands of hands over hundreds of years, and you get a slow-motion burn no crowd ever sees. Which is why, to understand the losses everyone keeps assigning to a single day, we have to follow one scroll from marsh to market to shelf to dust, and watch how the life of papyrus turns a library's calendar into a countdown. Start at the marsh. A cutter slides his knife into a green stalk thicker than his thumb. He lifts, twists, and frees a length of papyrus that has grown in the Nile's shallow water, the way wheat grows on land ants, reliable, seasonal. In sheds upriver, workers slice the stalk into long ribbons, lay one layer north-south and another east-west, press the lattice under boards, and seal it with river and sun. When it dries, the crossed fibers become a sheet. Many sheets glued edge to edge become a roll. A smooth stone polishes the writing face until it shines. Add a dab of gum at the end. Fix a wooden rod as a core, and you have the thing that made Alexandria possible. Cheap, fast paper by the yard. But cheap and fast come with a clock. Papyrus is plant. Plant rots. Damp air swells the fibers. Dry air makes them brittle. Salt from the harbor creeps into rooms near the quays and crystallizes in the pores. Fungi bloom where a lamp's heat meets a cool wall. Insects chew. Bookworm is not a single animal, but a cast of small mouths, beetle larvae, silverfish, booklets drawn to starch paste and plant pith. A scroll rolled and unrolled by 100 hands will crack first at the outer turn, then along the seams where sheets were glued. Librarians battled this with cedar oils, careful storage, and rules. Don't yank, don't fold, never leave a roll open on a bench, but rules are suggestions to time. Now add people. A library like Alexandria's is not a shrine where rolls nap in darkness. It is a traffic circle. Teachers check out popular texts, students copy extracts, editors collate variants. High-demand authors wear out fastest. A scribe faced with a damaged end trims away the torn portion and writes a new tag. On the heavens, Book 2. That quiet cut is a subtraction from civilization's memory. Multiply it by decades, and you have a library growing slightly shorter while no one's looking. Economics sharpen the blade. The Ptolemies could flood the city with fresh stock when the treasury was full. When money tightened, during wars, bad harvests, or court projects that swallowed budgets, fresh rolls arrived slower. The same plant that fed the library also fed a continental bureaucracy. Tax receipts, shipping tallies, temple accounts, court records. If the state told papyrus makers to prioritize administration, culture waited. And when it waits, it repairs rather than replaces. Repairs become reuse. Reuse takes many forms. The simplest is recycling the back. Most works were copied on the inner surface. The outer side, the back, the verso, was rougher and less pleasant to write on, but it was there. Clerks used it for lists, practice, letters, even household inventories. Turn a philosophical treatise over, and you might find a grocery note. That's not disrespect, it's thrift. Another form is patching gluing a fresh piece where a seam failed or a mouse found a meal. Patches keep a roll alive, but they also make it awkward to copy and fragile to lend. Then there is erasure. True palimpsests are more famous on parchment, which survives scraping. But even papyrus can be washed or abraded to take new ink, especially for short-term or low-status writing. The result is a ghost text beneath a newer hand. In a world where supply hiccups, ghosts multiply. The library's editors hated that. A clean text is a sharp tool. But the city's scribal economy didn't answer only to editors. Shopkeepers and provincial officials needed paper now. A catalog line that once pointed to a pristine copy begins, over years, to point to something grayer. A roll with patches, marginal glosses, a scuffed tail, a back crowded with the arithmetic of someone's month. Material fate meets fashion. Around the first centuries of our era, readers began to favor the codex-stacked sheets stitched at one side, the ancestor of the modern book. Codices open flat, waste less space, and allow easy indexing on page corners. Parchment codices, in particular, endure damp and handling better than papyrus scrolls. As codices spread, scrolls didn't burst into flame. They slipped in prestige. A crown library that wanted to look modern produced codex editions. The older rolls stayed on shelves for a while, then migrated downward into teaching rooms, then into private chests, then too often, into the afterlives that destroy content while preserving material. Mummy cartonnage, bindings, packing. A scroll that becomes a layer in a coffin mask is not burned, yet for the text it carries, The difference is academic. Supply chains break in quieter ways, too. The delta floods late, quality dips, and entire batches of papyrus curl and split a season or two early. A war upriver delays barges. A new tax skims profit and squeezes cutters to rush their drying. The finished sheets look fine in the scriptorium, but the glue lines are weak and the polish thin. 10 years later, a beloved copy opens with the sound skilled librarians dread. A soft tearing like fabric pulled past its promise. Put that sound in 100 rooms across 3 decades, and you get a loss curve that looks, from a distance, like a cliff. Even the best copies fracture through use. Editors in Alexandria loved good hands, scribes with a touch so even that letters seem printed. But good hands are expensive. When a royal stipend shrinks, work shifts to cheaper benches. A hurried copy accumulates small errors, skipped lines, repeated phrases, cramped letters that fade faster. A later corrector crowds the margin with fixes. A third hand adds glosses that spill between columns. After 50 years, the master is legible but busy. After a century, it is a dense forest only an expert can walk. That complexity discourages recopying. When the day comes to make a new clean edition, the copyist chooses an easier ancestor, the text that is less correct, but more readable. Quality slips while quantity looks stable. A library can die like that without any smoke at all. Fragility also lives in the room, not just the roll. Cupboards warp, lids crack. A leaky roof in a seaside climate rewards every careless seam with blooms of mold. The cure is maintenance money for carpenters and masons, influence to jump the repair queue, attention from patrons who think books are worth a roof. Lose anyone, and weather becomes an editor who doesn't read. There's a market angle to all this. Papyrus was cheap enough that private homes could own small libraries, poetry, plays, handbooks. Those household stocks supplemented the city's brain. But when papyrus prices rose or supply shrank, families sold or repurposed the rolls they used least. Private shelves thin first at the edges of need. Marginal works vanish while the greats hang on. A later age peering back mistakes that survivorship bias for canon and tells itself lesser works didn't exist. In truth, they existed and fed the debates that made the greats great. The derivative loss becomes permanent when a schoolroom stops teaching from variety and leans into a few safe titles, because fewer hands on fewer texts guarantees a steeper rot curve for everything else. If all this sounds like a slow disaster, that's the point. Papyrus turns time into a solvent. Fires leave ash layers. Rot leaves silence. Fires make enemies for stories to blame. Solvents make administrators whose names no one remembers. The Library of Alexandria lived and died on the calendar of a plant. When the city funded cutting, drying, gluing, and careful storage, the plant became paper, and paper became culture. When it didn't, the plant would turn to the river inside the shells themselves. And yet, material fate wasn't the only force thinning those ranks. Even the best-tended scroll can be removed by decree. Even the driest archive can be emptied by a crowd. The next cuts come not from worms or weather, but from words spoken in courts and sermons shouted in streets. The kind of choices that turn a paper problem into a citywide policy for what may be read at all. Edicts can change a city faster than fire. A torch needs wind, fuel, and a careless hand. A decree needs only a seal. In Alexandria, policy began to do the work people later blamed on a single blaze. Shrines that once doubled as classrooms were ordered closed. Offerings stopped. Lands were seized, buildings reassigned, and the rhythms that kept shells alive lectures, copying, loans lost their stage. You don't have to burn a book to make it disappear. You can outlaw the room where it's read. For centuries, the city had lived with overlapping loyalties. Egyptian rites, Greek philosophy, Jewish scholarship, Christian worship, imperial administration. The balance was noisy, but workable because each group had places to breathe. Then the late 4th century laws arrived like a new weather system. Public sacrifices? Forbidden. Temple incomes? Redirected? Idols? To be removed. On parchment, it looked like tidy reform. On the ground, it felt like a slow confiscation of memory. The Serapeum, which wrapped study in a sacred precinct, was not uniquely wicked. It was uniquely visible. Closing it sent a message to every smaller library tied to a shrine. Your shelves are now liabilities. Edicts don't operate alone. They give cover to ambition. A bishop who wants influence can point to the law and claim God's backing. A civic leader who wants a rival's crowd can steer it with a sermon. A zealot who resents the old order can dress his anger in righteousness. Alexandria had a talent for turning policy into street theater. Mobs surged and scattered. Processions crossed each other like braided ropes. Chants bounced off stone. In that noise, manuscripts became symbols. A scroll in the wrong room proved your loyalty to the wrong past. You didn't need to light it. You only needed to make its owner too nervous to keep it. When scholars lost their public platforms, they did not stop thinking. They changed addresses. Some moved into private houses and taught behind courtyard walls where voices wouldn't carry. Some took positions in church schools, keeping their tools while trimming the subjects that drew attention. Some left the city entirely, carrying personal rolls wrapped in cloth, which is how learning often survives. Not by institutions, but by hands. What didn't travel was the surplus, the extra copies used for training, the working text students shared on benches, the duplicates that let a class read the same author together. Those were the first to be given away, hidden, or quietly dismantled for writing material. Loss by policy begins at the edges and works inward. Lists started to matter more than catalogs. A catalog says, here is what we have. Here is where to find it. A forbidden list says, here is what no one should touch. The line between unsafe rituals and unsafe reading blurs quickly when leaders fear old gods hiding in old words. A geometry handbook looks harmless until someone remembers it was taught under the colonnade of a temple. A medical manual raises eyebrows if it mentions remedies tied to a shrine. A play that once felt like harmless fun is recast as a path back to superstition. The safer path becomes copying scripture and commentary, then copying only the commentary, then copying only the parts chosen for public reading. A city that once loved parallel versions learns to prize a single sanctioned one. That is how policy shrinks a library, by making librarians select themselves into silence. There were flashpoints, of course. Alexandria could turn a rumor into a riot before noon. A religious procession jostles a crowd headed for a festival. Insults fly, a fight breaks out. An official takes a side. Retaliation answers retaliation. And by nightfall, a workshop that also served as a reading room has a broken door and empty shelves. Chroniclers record the names most useful to their arguments. But below the headlines lived something harder to see. Students who stopped walking up certain streets, teachers who edited their reading lists, families who boxed their books and said they had never owned them. That is how a city forgets, not only in clashes, but in choices. Even the copy trade, that humming engine of survival, felt the pressure. A copyist who once juggled drama, law, and natural philosophy learned to earn his wages by producing homilies and lives of saints. Translators who had been prized for turning Phoenician or Egyptian works into Greek were asked to turn Greek into the language of the pulpit. The skills stayed. The direction changed. Texts that didn't feed the new demand waited on shelves that no longer had guardians willing to argue for them. A good scribe hates waste. A starving scribe hates risk. If a roll that carries a suspect author can be washed and reused to copy a safe text that pays, everyone knows which decision keeps food on the table. Architecture finished what law began. When temples became churches or storehouses, The rooms changed shape. A colonnade that once held benches sprouted walls. A library closet became a vestry. A wide, airy court learned to host gatherings that had nothing to do with reading. The old sightlines were lost, and with them the habits attached to those lines. Before, you could sit beneath a certain statue and expect a teacher to pass each morning. Now you passed a different threshold and expected different words. In that new map, a scroll room that remained intact looked out of place, and anything out of place invites questions that owners would rather not answer. None of this means faith and learning cannot coexist. Alexandria itself had long mixed priesthood and scholarship. The shift was not belief against books. It was control against independence. A city could accept study when study happened under an altar it approved. The tension arose when books represented an authority that didn't need the city's newer altars. That tension turned into a culture war, one that wore robes and used phrases like purity and reform. And culture wars rarely end with bonfires because they don't have to. They end with leases canceled, doors repurposed, and readers who decide quietly to stop being seen. Over time, this strip of policy and pressure did what no single inferno could have accomplished. It thinned the ranks of teachers. It moved reading out of sight. It made certain authors more trouble than they're worth. It taught a generation to associate open shelves in public spaces with chaos and private shelves with safety. It altered what a library meant. The miracle of Alexandria had been its publicity. Knowledge performed in the open. The new order preferred knowledge trained for the pulpit or the courtroom, not the portico. That preference pulled the city away from the habits that had once made it a magnet for every book floating on the sea. And yet, in later centuries, when people wanted one villain to blame for the library's end, they did not remember these laws, crowds, or quiet choices. They reached for a cleaner story about a new conqueror who rode in, heard about books, and allegedly gave one sentence that turned shelves into fuel. It's a famous line. It fits on a plaque. It also dissolves when you chase the trail of citations backward through time. If you've ever heard that the real destruction happened in 642, the next step is simple. Follow the footnotes and see how the story vanishes while you read. Say the date out loud. 642. A new army enters Alexandria. A general named Amr receives the keys to a city that has outlived pharaohs, kings, and Caesars. In the legend, he sends a question to the caliph. What to do with the books? The reply sharp as a proverb comes back. If they agree with the book, they're needless. If they disagree, they're dangerous. Feed the baths. For months, every public furnace blazes with Alexandria's memory until the last scrap curls to ash. It's a picture so clean you can frame it. It's also a story that falls apart the moment you tug at any thread. Start with the test every strong tale should pass. Who said it first, and when? The famous bath fuel line does not appear in accounts written anywhere close to 642. The earliest versions surface centuries later, copied by authors writing far from the event, addressing their own audiences, fighting their own debates. They repeat the anecdote as a moral either proof of ruthless efficiency or proof of hostility to learning. The punchline lands because by then people had already learned to imagine the library as a single hoarded treasure that you could destroy with one command. It's a parable, not paperwork. Now walk the earlier sources. Greek, Coptic, Syriac, Arabic chronicles talk about siege and surrender, new governors, tax deals, conversions of churches, even street fights over levies and land. They give details where you'd expect bureaucracy to care. Who paid what? Who kept which office? Who negotiated terms? What you do not find is an order to strip the city's shelves into fuel. No requisition of labor. No tally of recovered heretical works. No list of confiscated rooms. The silence isn't proof nothing burned. Alexandria has always known fire. It's proof that the spectacular purge later writers loved to quote wasn't part of the story told by those who watched the regime change at street level. Then run the logistics. Anyone who's ever heated water knows a stubborn truth. Papyrus is tinder, not coal. It flares. It doesn't sustain. To keep public baths hot for months, you'd need a steady river of dense fuel, day after day. That means caravans of scrolls crossing the city, guarded routes to stokeholes, foremen, clerks, and receipts. An administrative footprint as wide as a military campaign. And if you did try to burn rolls by the cart, you'd discover how quickly plant fiber vanishes to smoke. The numbers don't behave. The image works as rhetoric. It fails as engineering. The timeline misbehaves too. By the mid-7th century, Alexandria's head-in-hand, the palace complex, and the Serapeum had already been weakened for generations. The Serapeum's scholarly life ended in the 390s when decrees and crowds unmade their public study space. Teachers migrated to private houses. Copyists took safer commissions. Public shelves thinned. To say a new conqueror burned the library in 642 is to pretend the old machine still existed as a single room under a single key. It didn't. There were scrolls to seize, yes, privately held, locally stored, sometimes tied to a chapel or school, but the thing people later call the library had long since become a diaspora of habits. So why did the bath story spread? Because polemic loves a bonfire. One order, one villain, one lesson. The tale does two jobs at once. It paints the new rulers as enemies of books, and it absolves everyone who came before. If a stranger torched your shelves in one brutal flourish, then no local prefect ever underfunded copy benches. No bishop ever closed a classroom. No official ever let a roof leak. A single crime erases 1,000 small responsibilities. Blame is clean. Mourning is simple. History is tidy. There's also the tone. The line put in the caliph's mouth reads like a sermon, balanced, memorable, made to travel. Phrases that sticky usually travel light. No dates, no couriers, no reply time stamped in a chancery. But real administration lives on lists. A city with destruction of property leaves trails of names and numbers. The conquest sources are full of lists for taxes and stipends. They aren't full of lists for book fuel. Even if you grant that conquest always bruises books, and it does, the form of bruise matters. A soldier kicking a scriptorium door is not a policy about knowledge. A bath fed with broken furniture is not a plan to erase a canon. The 7th century fingerprints we can actually see in Alexandria are those of officials setting terms, not clerks inventorying scrolls for ovens. Follow the bath tale backward, and it thins until it snaps. Later writers quote one another, embroider, and repurpose the anecdote for debates that had very little to do with the lived city of 642. Meanwhile, the centuries that follow give us a counterweight the legend can't carry. Scholars writing in Arabic preserving, translating, arguing with, and extending Greek mathematics, medicine, optics, and philosophy, Baghdad's translation movement being only the most famous example. That record doesn't turn the 7th century into a golden age. It simply makes it hard to square the image of systematic book burning as state doctrine with the observable habit of saving and studying what paper could hold. There's a deeper weakness the bath story can't hide. It imagines knowledge as a horde, sleeping under one roof, waiting for an enemy with a torch. In reality, by 642 knowledge in Alexandria wreathed through people and places, private cupboards, church schools, small circles that met behind courtyard walls, teachers who moved as regimes changed. You can seize a storeroom. You can't seize a habit with one letter. The loss that hurt the most had already been unfolding for decades. Fewer public platforms, fewer benches, slower intake, more caution around certain subjects. A proverb doesn't create that. A proverb only hides it. None of this excuses the wounds every conquest leaves. A chest of rolls goes missing. A study room catches fire. A warehouse is raided under color of law. Pain doesn't need a slogan to be real. But when we trade a messy city for a neat bonfire, we lose the very information that would help us protect learning now. How policy shrinks a classroom, how materials fail, how budgets kill as surely as flames. The legend gives us a villain you can point at. The truth gives us a checklist you can fix. So if we set the bath story aside, what are we left with? Stones, ash, piers, foundation lines, toppled columns, and drowned courtyards. The ground and the harbor keep their own minutes burn layers, rebuild layers, routes that connect docks to the palace, footprints where shelves might have stood, quays where intake depots once swallowed cargo. Legends make smoke. Masonry remembers. To test the stories we've inherited, we have to leave the page and read the city itself. One trench, one quay, one broken stair at a time, and see what actually burned, what only blackened, and what simply stopped being maintained. Stones don't gossip. They keep minutes. If paper yields to rumor, masonry and mud complain in layers, in scorch bands, in robbed foundations, and reused columns. Walk Alexandria with a trowel, and you get a history that refuses to fit on a souvenir plaque. The city does not record one grand cremation of memory. It logs a series of injuries, some hot, some wet, some political spread over centuries. Start in the royal quarter, the Bruchion, where palace colonnades once shouldered the Mausians' rooms. Today its ground plan is a puzzle, because much of it no longer stands on ground. Parts of the eastern shoreline slid beneath the harbor over time. Quakes and subsidence did what no mob could. Under the water north and east of the modern fort, divers have traced drowned streets, key faces, broken colossi, carved lintels, and dressed blocks lying where courtyards once opened to the sea. You can measure corners. You can follow a drowned wall until it loses itself in silt. What you don't find is a blanket of ash sealing a whole district at once. The stones tell you those buildings ended in collapses and sinkings, not in a single night of flame. Follow the harbor edges where the Heptastadian causeway tied the city to the island light. The underwater topography keeps coughing up rings and sockets cut to tie ships, ramps for loading, and the heavy thresholds of warehouses, the sort of places where, from the ship's scrolls paused before clerks sent them uphill. If ever a port fire ate paper, it would leave its most obvious fingerprints here. A patchwork of heat-altered debris, char in the fill, a layer of soft, blackened sweepings trapped beneath later floors. What turns up fits a port that burned more than once, but healed between wounds. You get local ash lenses, not a citywide band. In other words, real fires, plural, not the fire, singular. Climb inland to the hill, crowned by the column people call Pompey's Pillar, a misnamed granite needle that in fact honors a late Roman emperor and marks the precinct where the Serapeum stood. Around it, archaeology reads like a conversation between policy and stone. Column drums that once marched around the court are found reused in later walls. Bases sit where they no longer match anything above. You can see where masons prized good blocks out of the precinct and carried them to build elsewhere. When a site dies by bonfire, you expect a uniform burn layer and sudden abandonment. Here you see dismantling, careful removal, repurposing, alteration. Doors were not simply kicked in and torches tossed. Rooms were emptied, furniture of learning broken up, pieces walked away. Even small clues resist the neat tale. In places where shelves would have stood, what survives are footprints of cupboards and low walls that changed function. Library recesses made into storage, reading spaces narrowed into passages. The pattern is strip and convert, not ignite and flee. Ancient accounts talk about the idol's fall and the precinct's humiliation, and the ground agrees with them on method. Public unmaking, then reallocation. Not a single pyre that consumed a city's memory in a week. Shift west to the urban belly between harbor and ridge, where life stacked itself in tight rows. When archaeologists peel back late Roman and early Byzantine floors, they sometimes meet the gray freckles of domestic fires, kitchens, workshops, lamp accidents, and here and there, scarred pockets that look like riot damage. But the strata don't carry a horizon of soot you can follow like a line across the city. If the late 4th century or the mid-1st century had seen an event that blackened everything at once, you would trace it from trench to trench. Instead, you read a pulse of rebuilds, repairs, and replacements. New thresholds cut into old blocks, alley drains lifted and reset, collapsed corners patched with whatever stone lay closest to hand. Then there is a place that never shows up in the legend, but won't stop appearing in the ground. el-Dikka. It is a quarter of auditorium, stepped lecture halls clustered like comb cells, dating to late Roman and early Byzantine centuries. Their benches are stone. Their thresholds are worn where feet found them morning after morning. Some rooms have low stages. Some bear scribbles that look suspiciously like student jokes. If the library's end were a single inferno centuries earlier, these rooms should not exist. But they do, and they are lecture halls, not latrines. They announce that public teaching in Alexandria continued into the 5th, 6th, even 7th centuries in spaces built for that purpose. Not the Mausian, not the Serapeum, but unmistakably the bones of a learning culture that adapted and kept speaking. Material culture backs the whisper. Ink pots, styluses, wax tablets, a basi, a straka with lines of practice Greek, that is the archaeology of a city that still writes. Even in the humid delta air that rots papyrus, you find the ghosts of writing in the things that supported it. If a citywide cremation of books had happened when later stories claim, these layers would sit silent. Instead, they look like continuity shot through with change. New patrons, new texts, same tools. Read the city's fabric and you get another refrain. Spolia. A carved architrave with pagan motifs turns up in a church wall. A finely finished block with a shelf's shadow serves as a doorstep in a bath. The same hand that once cut a niche for a scroll now props up a niche for a lamp. To a storyteller, this is desecration. To an archaeologist, it is evidence that the end of older spaces came with time to strip and sort. Fires do not leave you the leisure to match column drums to a builder's wagon. Administrations do. Underwater again, the palace quarter's drowned footprint tells a final stubborn truth about the one blaze memory. If the city's head had burned to the ground in 48 BCE, or 391 CE, or 642 CE, you would not expect to find so much masonry intact enough to map under the waves. Those blocks fell to the sea with corners still square. Their tumble records collapse and subsidence across centuries, likely finishing blows from earthquakes. The sea took what flame could not reach. A myth that puts all the loss on a match cannot make sense of a library district swallowed by water. Put all of this together: localized ash, dismantled precincts, reused stone, lecture halls that outlast legends, keys built for steady intake in archaeology gives you a more demanding story. Alexandria's knowledge machine suffered repeated shocks. A port fire that hurt its supply line. A temple closure that erased a public annex. Quakes and subsidence that drowned palaces. Slow budget-thin winters. Material decay in a damp, salty air. None of those alone explain the legend. All of them together create the long silence the legend tries to compress. The ground will not certify a single villain. It will show you a system that lost redundancies until one more push, any push, made the lights feel like they went out at once. And when the ground in Alexandria runs out when silt covers the royal quarters, and the city's later streets sit on top of the earliest, one's another kind of evidence takes over. The papers that escaped, the texts that survived by leaving. To see the afterlife of Alexandria's shelves, you don't stay at the harbor. You travel upriver to dry towns where rubbish heaps kept poems alive, across the sea to a villa where heat turned a library to charcoal instead of ash, and east to scriptoria that made Greek ideas speak new languages. The city's breath kept going, just not always in the city that exhaled it first. If a city's mind can die, why do we keep finding its breath in other places? Because ideas travel better than buildings. Alexandria's shelves thinned, its annexes were closed or converted, and yet the words that once hummed under those colonnades kept walking upriver into the dry towns of Middle Egypt, across the sea into a villa buried by a mountain, east into copy houses where new alphabets learned to carry old thoughts. The legend wants a single funeral. The ground gives us a diaspora. Begin where paper lasts longest, in the desert. Oxyrhynchus was no marble capital, just a dusty provincial town where people threw things away and the air forgot to rot them. Outside its walls, rubbish mounds rose like low dunes made of broken pottery, food scraps, sandals, and paper, the cheap kind. Papyrus contracts with smudged signatures, tax receipts, school exercises with tight letters, then looser ones with a child tired, private letters that start with news of the weather and end with the price of fish. In that mess, teens with brushes and patience found a different kind of library, a city's everyday mind trapped where humidity could not reach. Mixed in with the receipts were gifts no marble hall had managed to keep, a poem that only existed by rumor, a play you knew from one line and now could read in full, pieces of Sappho singing across centuries, diagrams from Euclid that show a teacher's hand at work in the margin, fragments of early gospels beside grocery lists. Oxyrhynchus taught a hard truth. The line between great literature and junk is a trick of survival. Alexandria curated high and low together. The desert saved the whole mix by accident. That is how a knowledge system leaks into the future through whatever container happens to be driest. Turn north and west and let a volcano do what the Nile could not. When Vesuvius drowned Herculaneum in 79 CE, it did not leave libraries in ash. It carbonized them. In a seaside villa later, called the Villa of the Papyri, rolls turned into dark cylinders that looked like charcoal sticks. For centuries, anyone who touched them destroyed them. Then patient hands learned to unroll the least damaged ones. Poems appeared. Philosophical works surfaced, many tied to Philodemus, an Epicurean whose lectures had once filled those rooms with calm argument. More recently, light itself, the kind beyond what eyes can see, was used to read what fingers cannot touch. X-rays that map ink inside a roll still closed, imaging that follows the twist of fibers and the shine of a letter stroke. The irony is sharp. The fire that Alexandria's myth fears can sometimes be the thing that seals a library against air and time. The villa's char is a vault. Alexandria's damp was a solvent. Go east now, to a city that learned to keep copying when others argued about statues. In Constantinople, scribes made Greek fit a new speed by shrinking letter forms into minuscule, tighter, faster, cheaper, without becoming sloppy. Copy houses there, and in nearby centers, turned out clean texts for rulers, bishops, and schools. Alongside them, readers with the instincts of Callimachus built new kinds of maps, lexica that list rare words, the Suda, a giant dictionary that preserves quotations no one else saved, Florilegia that excerpted choice passages, and the summaries of a 9th century scholar who read hundreds of books and left behind a catalog of what each one said. Those guides are not shells, they are scaffolds. When later fires and quakes knocked sections of the building away, the scaffold still showed where rooms had been. Even erasures hid gifts. Parchment, tougher than papyrus, could be scraped and written on again. Monks reused old pages to copy prayers or sermons, and in doing so created palimpsests, 2 layers of time pressed into one skin. Under certain lights, the lost layer returns. A prayer book yields an ancient geometry text. A hymnal hides a page of a scientist probing how bodies float. Suddenly, a library that no longer exists points at itself through the ghost of a knife. Alexandria would recognize the trick. Copying is a way of remembering. Recopying is a way of surviving. Overwriting, when technology later peels it back, is a way of speaking twice. The chain didn't stop in Greek. In Syria and Mesopotamia, schools that used Syriac, a cousin of Aramaic, learned to be translators as much as teachers. When Greek rule shrank and new rulers rose, those scholars became ridges. Texts moved from Greek into Syriac, then into Arabic. Physicians carried handbooks across languages because patients don't care about alphabets. Mathematicians carried methods because numbers travel. Philosophers carried arguments because questions walk faster than armies. In Baghdad and other centers, workshops turned translation into a craft. Multiple drafts, peer correction, glosses that explain hard words. That stream is not a footnote to Alexandria's story. It is one of its main channels. The habit of standardizing, cataloging, and arguing that lived under the Mausians' roof learned to breathe in different houses. Farther west, a town buried by a mountain gave us heat-sealed rolls. Farther east, monasteries on rocky peninsulas gave us slow, stubborn copying. Upriver, rubbish mounds stacked a city's paper luck into time capsules. In Cappadocia, Armenia, Egypt, Italy, and the islands, private and monastic libraries hoarded what they could. A page here, a quire there, a citation and a commentary no one reads for pleasure, and yet inside that dull wrapper, a line from a lost play that breathes like air from a sealed room. The survival map looks like starlight through thin cloud, a scatter, not a sheet, but bright enough to show you the outline of the thing you can't see whole. Notice the pattern. Where a text is copied for use, medicine, law, calendars, it runs the gauntlet and often lives. Where a text is tied to a single ritual space, it dies when that space is shut. Where a poem is loved enough to be recopied by schoolboys, it survives with scars. Where a work is mostly quoted by others, it lives on as shreds sewn into later cloth. That is why encyclopedias and lexicons matter. They are not the main stage. They are the understudies who remember the lines when the lead never arrives. What all of these survivals refuse is the neatness of the one blazed tale. If Alexandria had ended with a single night, the chain would snap hard, and our later libraries would feel the break like a missing tooth. Instead, we feel a slow thinning a gap here, a shift there, covered in part by other centers that kept the habits alive. Indexing, comparing, translating, repackaging. That's not an excuse for the losses. It is a plan for endurance. Build redundancies. Spread the work. Copy in more than one place. Teach more than one hand to carry the same line. So how did the single night myth defeat such a stubborn, complicated truth? It didn't happen by accident. Stories have editors the way texts do, and over centuries, a set of hands turned a long leak into a clean glaze. Some were ancient moralists who wanted a lesson. Some were Renaissance printers who needed a preface for their rediscoveries. Some were modern directors who understood that one dramatic shot of flames is more work than 100 quiet scenes of budget meetings. To see how the legend was stitched, we have to follow the stitchers, the people who made memory into a script, who taught us to imagine a single night of fire. Not the ground, not the earliest witnesses. The legend has editors people who shaped centuries of drips and dents into one clean blaze, because a blaze is easier to remember, easier to weaponize, and easier to sell. Start close to the docks, but a century after the siege. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, passes along a number tens of thousands of rolls lost in the warehouses during Caesar's fighting, likely echoing Livy. Warehouses, not the crown stacks, a specific wound, not a funeral. Yet once a number sits on a page, later pens find it useful. A tidy count makes grief portable. Then Plutarch, a Greek writing under Rome, tells us Caesar burned the ships and the flames spread. Spread to where? He leaves it suggestive. Many places is a phrase that lets future imaginations run uphill. Meanwhile, Strabo, who actually lived in Alexandria around that time, described the Mausians' life without writing its obituary. The early sources disagree because the city did many things at once: heal, rebuild, repurpose, and keep reading. When the empire's weather turned, new editors arrived with new motives. Orosius, a Christian polemicist in the early 5th century, argued that pagan times were violent and that his own age was gentler. He seized on the Caesar story and pressed it into service. Look how pagan wars destroyed libraries. Don't blame the Christians. He even claimed to have seen the empty cupboards near the Serapeum, a clever flourish that turns a political close-in convert into the aftermath of an old fire. With a stroke, he shifted blame backward and softened the sharper truth of late 4th century decrees that shut the annex. Church historians who chronicled the end of the Serapeum did their own shaping. Socrates Scholasticus recorded the idol's fall and the precinct's dismantling real events. But in a city that loved drama, readers stitched those scenes to earlier smoke. The temple's public undoing made a better picture than a slow, administrative thinning of shelves. From there, it was easy to let the library die in the same paragraph as the statue, even if the temple's learning rooms and the palace stacks were not the same thing. Centuries later, another set of hands added the neatest line of all. Medieval and early modern writers in Arabic, Syriac, and then Latin passed around a proverb hung on the 7th century conquest. If the books agree with the book, they are needless. If they disagree, they are harmful, burn them. The line appears long after the event, in authors writing far from the scene, for audiences hungry for moral clarity. The sentence is perfect theater, balanced, cruelly logical, unforgettable. It also functions like a trapdoor. If you swallow it, you fall past centuries of routine copying in Arabic and Syriac, past scholars who translated and argued with Greek texts, straight into a pit where one order explains everything. The proverb survives because it flatters the readers who repeat it. We know the villain. We can stop reading the footnotes. Renaissance humanists took the torch and changed its color. They loved to mourn what they were rediscovering. Printers wrote prefaces that staged their editions as rescues from night. Scholars framed their finds as light breaking into a world that had somehow slept for 1,000 years. The trope required a disaster behind them, something grand enough to explain the gaps now being filled. The Library of Alexandria, already a symbol, became the symbol. The more they lit the Renaissance, the darker they painted what came before. Enlightenment polemics sharpened the silhouette. If you wanted to argue that reason had finally unseated superstition, you needed an image of superstition at its strongest. A library pulled down by zealots or vanished in one blaze was perfect. Learning as victim, faith as arsonist, reason as the new firefighter. There were real episodes of violence. There were real decrees that closed doors. There were real losses. But the single-night hive-mind image played better in essays than the messy record of budgets, building maintenance, and copy shop economics. No need to talk about papyrus rot or port policy when a bonfire will do. By the 19th century, textbook writers and popular historians condensed the edits into a capsule. One paragraph, one date, one villain. They liked numbers with long tails: 40,000, 400,000, 700,000, because numerals make authority feel hard, even when the counting system rolls versus titles, duplicates versus works would make any modern librarian wince. A big figure plus a big flame equal a big feeling. A footnote about how ancient bookkeeping works equals silence. Modern media finish the job. Posters show shells turning to torches. Documentaries pan across CGI halls as sparks fall like rain. A feature film sets an attack on temple precincts as if it were the death of the original crown stacks. An iconic TV series teaches a generation to feel the loss in their bones by staging a single wall of fire and a martyr whose death stands in for a city's slow unthreading. The emotional truth is real. When institutions stop protecting study, people and pages suffer. But the image's neatness lies. It hides the list of culprits that actually matter. Policies, materials, budgets, urban redesign, decrees, riots, quakes, subsidence, and the slow replacement of public reading with private fear. Why did so many editors of memory prefer the blaze? Because a blaze excuses. If a stranger's torch did it, no local official ever strangled acquisitions. No bishop ever closed a classroom. No dynasty ever shifted money from paper to spectacle. No port clerk ever stopped seizing shipboard manuals. The bonfire is absolution for the living, and a sales pitch for whoever claims to be bringing the light back now. The remedy is not to erase the symbol, but to read through it. Keep the feeling of grief. Replace the scapegoat with a system diagram. Ask who authored each layer of loss and what their incentives were. Follow the paper, follow the money, follow the rooms. Suddenly, the story stops being a tragedy you can only watch and becomes a checklist you can act on. Diversify formats, duplicate holdings, spread institutions across neighborhoods and patrons, keep indexes public, fund maintenance, copy across languages, never tie a library to a single altar or a single ruler's pride. One more piece of editing remains to unmask: the numbers. The legend's power grows when the count grows. 40,000? 400,000? 700,000? Those figures aren't just statistics. They are scripts. To break the spell, you have to open the counting book itself. What a book meant, how catalogers tallied rolls, how duplicates in commentaries inflated totals, how a single work could occupy a dozen slots. Only when you see how the math was made can you see how grief was multiplied to fill a legend's frame. How big was it really? The legend loves an answer with a long tail. 40,000, 400,000, 700,000. Big numbers feel like respect. They also do quiet work for the myth, because if the hoard is vast enough, a single blaze feels proportionate. But if you open the counting book that ancient librarians actually used, you watch those totals swell and shrink depending on what the word book means, who is doing the tally, and what they want the number to prove. Start with the word itself. In antiquity, a book was a roll of biblion made of glued sheets of papyrus wound on a stick. A long work lived on many rolls. One history might fill 20. A poet's collected hymns could run to several, and each roll counted. Catalogs listed not just works, but how many rolls each work used, because knowing whether on animals had 15 rolls or 18 told a reader if they were missing a piece. So when a source says 40,000 books, it does not mean 40,000 distinct titles. It means 40,000 rolls containers, which could represent a much smaller number of unique works. Roll counting is only the first swell. Duplicates were a feature, not a flaw. The library deliberately sought variant copies to collate, because differences reveal the cleanest reading. If you own 5 copies of On Nature, 2 from bookshops, 1 from a temple chest, 1 seized from a ship's pilot, and 1 sent by a king, you count 5 rolls for Book I. The catalog notes the differences. The editors fight over which line is right, and the raw count inflates, while the intellectual gain is a single improved text. Ancient totals rarely tell you how many duplicates lurk inside them. Commentary multiplies too. A famous work inspires gloss after gloss marginal notes that grow into independent rolls called hypomnemata. A city that edits as aggressively as Alexandria will have stacks of these, line-by-line explanations, variant lists, parallel passages scouted from other shelves. In a librarian's math, each commentary roll is a book. In a modern reader's head, they are auxiliaries to one work. The difference matters if you're using the total to mourn a blaze. You can lose 1,000 commentary rolls and still have the work they orbit. A grief measured only by roll count makes that nuance invisible. Then there are epitomes and extracts, condensed versions of sprawling texts meant for teaching or quick consultation. A 20-roll history might spawn a 3-roll epitome, a single roll summary of dates, and a teacher's extract of key speeches. Each counts. A diligent cataloger records them all because students reach for shortcuts as easily then as now. Multiply that across genres, and the library's size grows again without adding new authors. Formats complicate counting in the other direction. In the early centuries of our era, the codex stacked pages bound at one side began to take market share from the roll. If a library bought or produced codex copies, what did it log? A codex that contained 3 of a philosopher's books could be tallied as one physical object housing 3 works. A roll-based count would have logged 3 books. A catalog that mixes formats makes raw totals misleading unless you know how the librarian normalized them. Ancient writers who throw numbers into anecdotes almost never say which counting rule they used. Even within rolls, size shifts totals. Rolls varied in diameter and sheet count. A short roll might hold a single slim treatise. A fat one could house 2 books of a long work. A shelf stuffed with small diameter rolls yields more books per cubit than one filled with thick ones. So when storytellers brag or moan using only a number, they are playing a shell game with space. The Mausians' rooms were big. The Serapeum's porticos were long. Could they have held hundreds of thousands of rolls in the physical sense? Possibly, if you spread them across years and sites, with dense shelving and good logistics. But the physical plausibility doesn't rescue the rhetorical inflation. A high roll count doesn't mean a high count of unique minds. Ancient numeracy itself likes roundness. Greek and Latin writers loved myriads, tens of thousands, and multiples thereof. 40,000 can mean a very large lot, not a ledger-precise audit. In rivalry, round numbers harden. Pergamon and Alexandria competed. Patrons boasted, courtiers flattered. Tell a king his library holds 700,000 books, and you earn a smile. Tell him it holds approximately 143,600 rolls, representing perhaps 16,000 unique titles if we adjust for duplicates and commentaries. And you earn the look an accountant gets at a banquet. The social function of numbers is flattery, and awe as often as it is measurement. We can run a thought experiment to see how fast totals grow without adding new authors. Imagine a shelf devoted to one household name. Call him the philosopher. His physics spans 8 rolls. His On the Soul spans 3. His On Animals spans 15. Add 5 rolls of commentary for each, 2 epitomes, and 3 extract rolls used in teaching. Add 4 duplicates for each book, because variant hunting matters. Your single author now consumes more than 100 rolls. Multiply across a dozen marquee names, then across popular dramatists, then across legal, medical, astronomical, and travel handbooks, and a roll count breaks 6 figures without any conspiracy or miracle. It is just how an editorial library works. Now reverse the trick and ask if steep numbers could be too small. The Mausion didn't just collect literature. It vacuumed up the written world, harbor manuals, pilot's charts, temple inventories, technical notes from workshops, local laws, tax codes, recipes. Those categories multiply books quietly because practical writing is brief and abundant. A crate of pilot's paraploy coastal sailing directions might hold 100 rolls before you touch a poet. If a storyteller's number excludes the low genres to make the total sound nobler, it shrinks what the institution actually did. If it includes them, it inflates the aura of great works, as if every roll were a masterpiece. Either way, the number tells a story first, and a fact second. What about the famous catalog the Pinakes often invoked to justify high counts? Its very scale, 100-plus rolls, tempts modern minds to extrapolate a shelf count from a catalog count. But catalogs expand faster than rooms because they log works that exist elsewhere, wish lists of titles to acquire, and alternate attributions. The Pinakes was an index of the Greek-speaking world's mind, not only of one city's current holdings. To treat it as a straight inventory is to make a map the same size as the country. A last inflation hides in language. When later writers translated earlier totals, book, volume, roll, and work bled into one another. A translator's volume might mean a roll. A reader's book might mean a title. Copyists rounding or improving, a boast by adding a zero, did not imagine someday historians would build a legend on the digit they idly drew. The numbers' journey from bench to tail added varnish with every retelling. Does any of this mean Alexandria was small? Not at all. It means its bigness can't be captured by a single integer. Size, lives, and functions. The speed of intake at the docks. The ambition of a catalog that recorded incipits and roll counts. The editorial benches that compared variants and produced master copies. The annex that turned scholarship into public teaching. Those are the metrics that tell you how much of the world a library can digest. A hoard of 100,000 neglected rolls is not bigger than a living institution that constantly updates, corrects, and exports clean texts. This is where the legend leans on arithmetic to support its one blaze plot. Oversized totals make the library feel like a dragon's pile. A dragon's pile invites a hero or a villain with a torch. End the hoard in a night, and the number collapses with a satisfying whoosh. If you replace the pile with the machine that actually existed, the narrative changes. A fire can wound supply lines. Decrees can close rooms. Materials can betray their owners. Budgets can slow hands. The loss becomes a ledger of choices, not a moment of fate. And that brings us to the question the numbers were always hiding. Who benefited from turning a long, manageable list of causes into one spectacular burn? Who gained politically, culturally, even commercially, from a story in which a library's end is nobody's fault except the one man with a match? To answer that, you have to set the abacus aside and follow incentives the way blame travels, the way absolution is sold, and the way a clean tragedy lets institutions off the hook. Ask a blunt question. Who wins when the Library of Alexandria dies in one night? Not the books, not the copyists or teachers. The winners are the people who prefer a clean legend to a messy ledger, because a single blaze moves blame into the past and turns every later decision-maker into a mourner instead of a culprit. Begin with the first stakeholders. Courts. The Ptolemies built the knowledge machine as part of kingship. A city that owns the world's words looks like it deserves to rule. But court projects devour coin. Palaces, fleets, festivals, mercenaries, everything competes with papyrus and stipends. When budgets thin, the easiest cut is the one that only scholars notice. Fewer inspectors at the docks, fewer agents buying rolls abroad, fewer translators on payroll, slower repairs. A burn tale hides those choices. If Caesar, or any one villain, destroyed everything, and no king ever neglected the benches, the crown can lament, lay a wreath on memory, and move on to pageantry. Next, Rome. Administrators love stories that let them be absolvers. Under emperors, Alexandria kept its prestige and its cost. A narrative that blames a past blaze lets governors praise culture without paying for its infrastructure. We honor learning. They can say, we did not commit the crime. Meanwhile, funds flow to ports and legions. The city's teachers adapt and survive without a line item in the prefect's accounts. Rome's propaganda prefers a single tragic blaze over spreadsheets full of delayed roof repairs. Then the bishops and their rivals in the late 4th century. When imperial edicts shuttered temples, leaders needed to convince a restive city that closing sanctuaries would not impoverish its mind. A legend about an earlier fire helps. If the library had died long ago then current closures target superstition only, not learning. If public reading now happens in church schools, it is not a replacement of one curriculum with another. It is salvation after a ruin. The blaze becomes a doctrinal convenience, a line that separates their past from our present, while recasting a policy of consolidation as mercy. Politics always finds use for grief. A civic faction that wants a rival stage can point to the myth and say, "We're protecting what little remains. Centralize it under us." A governor who wants a tighter grip on speech can argue that dispersed reading is unsafe in a city that once watched its treasures burn. Better to keep texts where reliable hands can monitor them. Safety becomes a gate. The legend supplies the justification to trade open shelves for controlled rooms. Centuries later, conquerors and defenders both reach for the blaze. A ruler who needs to cast predecessors as barbarians can claim to restore what a fire took. A ruler who needs to cast new arrivals as barbarians can say a fire took what local policy actually eroded. In both scripts, the speaker is the savior. The details don't matter because a single image, the red wall, does the rhetorical work. A city gets to feel noble pain while forgetting the name of the clerk who let the catalog lapse. Printers and patrons in the Renaissance profit too. Rediscovery sells copies. So does nostalgia. A press can frame each edition as a rescue from night, and a patron can fund it to burnish their own glory. The dupe is torchbearer, the scholar is brave spelunker, the printer is blacksmith of light. The market loves stakes. A lost in a fire, past makes every book feel like a reprieve. That pitch is hard to make if the truth is 1,000 small neglects, plus 3 quakes and decades of damp. Enlightenment polemic sharpened the benefit. Thinkers who wanted to argue that reason had finally replaced superstition needed an origin story where superstition behaved like an arsonist. Place the icon of learning in a temple precinct. Have a zealot crowd topple a statue and torch the books, and you get perfect theater. One act, one villain, one moral. The reality grants reallocated, curriculum narrowed, rooms repurposed, doesn't stage as well. So the legend stays, not because it is truer, but because it is filmable. Modern states also find comfort in the blaze. National narratives need clean breaks. Golden Age, Fall, Restoration. A single fire aligns with that rhythm. It allows ministries to claim they are rebuilding heritage by funding a museum wing while leaving archival maintenance underfed. It lets tourist brochures mourn and monetize at once. Come see the place where everything burned. Public feeling is harnessed. Line items remain small. Censorship quietly benefits too. If you make people believe that knowledge mainly dies by flame, they will watch for bonfires and miss the quieter tools. Licensing regimes, budget attrition, procurement bottlenecks, building code excuses, catalog access narrowed to authorized researchers, and 1,000 tiny rules that make copying slow. A blaze blinds the eye to policy. When the story ends in smoke, you stop looking at minutes and memos. Even philanthropy likes the legend. A donor moved by a dramatic loss funds a beautiful reading room or a named hall visible, photogenic rather than the unglamorous systems that keep collections alive. VAC, pest control, fire suppression, digital duplication, salaries for catalogers who will never appear in a painting. The myth directs money to optics and away from infrastructure. A blaze killed the library. Let our wing be the answer. Meanwhile, the ducks rust. Media and entertainment have an obvious incentive. 1,000-year maintenance saga is not a 2-hour film. A bonfire is. One shot of shelves turning to torches says in seconds what the slow truth would take a season to explain. Producers reach for the symbol because it communicates. Audiences absorb the symbol because it feels right. After enough repetitions, the picture becomes the memory. Even we, the viewers, reap a perverse comfort. If a single villain did it in one night, there is nothing we could have done. We are absolved. We are spared the harder duty the real story assigns. Shoulder-boring maintenance, boring budgets, boring redundancy. The legend lets us cry without committing to fix the pipes. There is one more beneficiary the blaze serves. Gatekeepers of knowledge. When loss is framed as a random catastrophe, rather than a managed decline, institutions that preside over archives are shielded from scrutiny. It burned ends questions. We stopped funding intake invites them. A myth that blames heat instead of policy protects the reputations of those who set policy and ensures the next policy can quietly repeat the cycle. So the burn is useful to almost everyone except readers. It comforts courts, launders politics, fuels fundraising, flatters saviors, sells tickets, and dulls the public's appetite for the unglamorous work that actually keeps memory alive. That is why the blaze keeps returning whenever someone needs to explain a gap. It is a magic trick with a moral attached. Look there, flames, not here, forms. If the blaze is a decoy, what really happened, and what can we learn from the mechanics of the decline? The answer isn't as dramatic, but it is more powerful. It shows how a knowledge machine fails in slow motion, and more importantly, how to build one that refuses to die one the size of a city, with redundancies that no torch or decree can silence. To get there, we have to set aside the funeral and reconstruct the body. Intake, catalog, copy, teach, fund, and scatter, then test each organ for failure points until a blueprint appears. Rebuild the body. Not on a poster, not as a fantasy of marble halls, but as a system that refuses the easy ways Alexandria failed. The first organ is intake. The old city ran everything through a few keys and a royal rule. Seize, copy, keep. That made the stream strong and brittle. A port fire, a policy change, a warship anchored in the wrong wind, and the hoses kinked. The fix is many mouths. If you want a library that can't be silenced, you don't feed it from one dock. You build intakes in every neighborhood, schools, clinics, courts, labs, theaters, radio rooms, each with a way to funnel what they make into shared memory. Alexandria annexed knowledge by seizure. We annex it by invitation and habit. Default capture, default duplication, default deposit. The second organ is the catalog. Callimachus taught the world that metadata is civilization. When you can say what a thing is, where it is, how long it runs, whom it belongs to, and which twins it resembles, you can find it again, even when the shelf is gone. The Pinakes died, and yet its logic lived because it solved a human problem so perfectly. The blueprint says, make the map public. Don't let the index hide behind a single desk or login. The moment the catalog lives under one key, you have built a story begging for a single villain. Let the map of the collection be as everywhere as a street grid mirrored, printed, cached, taught to children as a civic language. The third organ is copying. Alexandria was a factory. It won because it normalized noisy labor. One reads, two write, as senior checks. When budgets thinned, quality slipped, and noisy copies drove good ones off the bench. Copying is maintenance, not romance. Fund it like fire suppression. Set a quota for redundancy too local, too remote, one in a different script or format, so that each text breathes in more than one climate and alphabet. Papyrus rotted in damp. Parchment survived scraping. Codices beat rolls for handling. Today, a work should exist as print you can touch, as digital you can search, as microform you can misshelve for 50 years and still raid, and as an offline image vault that powers up even when the grid fails. Formats are not fashion. They are hedges against weather, war, and administrators. The fourth organ is teaching. Calm el-Dikka's little auditorious stone benches, worn thresholds, are the quiet counter-argument to bonfire myths. A city keeps its mind by performing it in public. Tie your library to classrooms that don't share a single roof or budget line. Pay teachers to show people how to use the catalog, not only the books. Put seminar tables in markets, clinics, transit hubs. When reading lives where people already gather, a decree that closes one building can't end the ritual. The Serapeum's fall warned us what happens when shelves share a fate with one altar. Make many altars out of ordinary rooms. The fifth organ is policy. Edicts unmade the Serapeum as efficiently as any torch. You can't legislate curiosity, but you can legislate its shelters. Open records laws with teeth. Deposit mandates that treat research and public business as civic assets. Procurement rules that fund dull things first: roofs, climate control, pest management, backups. And governance that can't be captured by one party, one bishop, one billionaire patron. Audit shelves like you audit bridges. Publish failure points the way cities publish water quality. The enemy of myth is paperwork that the public can read. The sixth organ is money, and the cure is to make boredom sacred. Donors like dramatic rescues. Politicians like ribbon cuttings. The body needs ductwork. Build endowments that pay catalogers' salaries forever. Create budget locks that can't be raided for pageantry. Reward funders who underwrite redundancies that no one will see. If the moral of Alexandria has any practical edge, it's this: maintenance is the hero. Put the hero's name on the vent system if that's what it takes. The seventh organ is scattering. The city's worst fragility was centralization crown stacks in the palace quarter, annex shelves in a temple precinct. When those patrons stumbled, rooms emptied. Scatter copies across rivals who do not like each other. Universities, churches, unions, broadcasters, city agencies, neighborhood groups. Ensure the memory of each against the other's fears. A text guarded by friends is safe. A text guarded by mixed interests is safer. Next comes recovery drills. Alexandria rebuilt after fires and sieges because people knew how the work flowed. Make that knowledge muscle memory. Run paper floods and server smoke rehearsals the way schools run fire drills. Teach a teenager to bag a shelf in 10 minutes and carry its catalog to safety. Teach a clerk in a clinic to make a clean scan that any archive will accept. Practice the slow heroism a legend can't glamorize. Then comes humility about numbers. Totals can inspire or deceive. A city can boast 1 million items and still be starving if the items are duplicates and commentary while core works rot. Publish the health of the body. Percentage of works represented in 3 formats. Percentage mirrored off-site. Average time between edits to the catalog. Number of independent patrons paying for infrastructure. Number of classrooms within a 5-minute walk of a shelf. These are the counts that say whether your library is a hoard or a living animal. Finally, build a culture that resists the easy excuse. If people are taught that books mostly die by flame, they will watch only for smoke. Teach them the real causes: apathy, single points of failure, supply chain kinks, gatekeeping, fashion, damp. Celebrate the administrator who fixes roofs as loudly as the scholar who wins prizes. Put maintenance logs on walls the way ships hang duty rosters. Make survival visible. When you assemble this body intake, catalog, copy, teach, policy, money, scatter, drill, measure, and culture, you get something a legend can't swallow. A library that can be wounded, yes, but not removed in one night by a match or a motto. Alexandria's gift is not its myth, it's its mechanics. It shows us exactly where machines fail and exactly where they can be built stronger than any story. And once you see that, the last question isn't about smoke at all. It's about what the legend was really hiding in plain sight the whole time, and why we keep choosing the clean grief over the fixable truth. Picture the harbor again, but strip the flames out of it. What remains is a city of habits. Runners with armfuls of rolls, editors arguing over lines, teachers wearing steps smooth at calm el-Dikka, clerks oiling lids, priests and prefects negotiating whose room holds which shelves. That living rhythm, not a dragon's hoard, was the Library of Alexandria. It did not vanish in a single night. It thinned in salt air, in budget winters, in edicts that closed one kind of doorway and reopened another, in copy benches that went quiet when stipends shifted. Fires hurt. Quakes drowned. But the death we inherited was an edit, not an event. The legend will keep its power because it offers a clean grief and an easy villain. Yet the stubborn record stones, silt, lecture halls, papyri from desert dumps, charred rolls that still speak under modern light points to a truth with more use. Knowledge survives in systems, not in symbols. Callimachus's metadata, the Mausians' copy discipline, the Serapeum's public teaching, the translators who carried Greek into Syriac and Arabic, the scribes who learned to write smaller and cheaper. These are the muscles that pulled ideas through centuries when buildings failed. So let the myth do its one good job. Make us care. Then refuse its excuse. Build intake everywhere. Keep catalogs public. Copy across formats, scripts, and cities. Fund maintenance first. Scatter guardians. Drill for dull disasters. Measure what matters. Teach in the open. If we do that, our libraries, physical and digital, civic and private, won't need a Marvel legend to feel grand. They'll be what Alexandria was at its best, a city that makes remembering a daily act. The shoreline is still there. The wind still comes off the water. What we choose to carry up the hill, this time on screens and in crates, and in heads that know the roots, decides whether our own descendants inherit a bonfire story or a working map. The difference isn't fate. It's design.